Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Diane Mathewitz. I'm the co-host here at the Labor Forum. You are listening to WRFG 89.3 FM in Atlanta. And we have another great show for you today. Seated beside me is Paul McLennan, who's also part of the team here at WRFG and the Labor Forum. Behind the switches here on the board is Christopher Hollis, and on the video equipment is Azi Ibrahimi. And the four of us today will be organizing and speaking and presenting this information that we hope that you find most useful. The song that always starts the Labor Forum off is by John Fromer. It's called We Do the Work. We hope that you find your job listed in there, but if you don't hear your job, you know that you are one of those that do the work, and that is why we choose that song, because we want to talk about all of you who do the work that keeps all society running. The opinions that are expressed on this program are not necessarily those of the Board of Directors, staff, or volunteers at WRFG. But the Labor Forum is one of the many long-running programs here at WRFG, which goes to the core of our mission, which is, as you heard at the beginning, we want to bring the voices of those who have been left out, who suffer from discrimination and oppression and exploitation. So I want to start first off by reminding everyone, as you have heard many times over the last 2+ weeks, that this is the Summer Fund Drive, the pledge drive for WRFG. We are a listener-supported station. It's what allows us to be independent, meaning that we are not totally under the thumb. We're not even a little bit under the thumb of corporate interests who essentially have started a war on the workers, who have deepened a war on the workers. And so we are able to bring you this program and all the other programming. There's not some CEO sitting up in some tower in Wall Street telling us what to play and what issues to discuss. We are here to discuss what's important to you. And we hope that in return you will contribute to the best of your ability to keep this station on air. We remind you that you always can go to our website, wrfg.org, click on the donate button. You can donate to any of the programs as a form of appreciation. We certainly would like it if you would contribute money to the Labor Forum. It's a way that we here behind the microphones and behind the board know that you in fact do appreciate the information that you're getting, the discussion that you're hearing here on the Labor Forum. So I do want to thank all of you who have donated over the last 2+ weeks. Encourage those of you who perhaps weren't able to do it before, if you are able now, to please go to the website. You also can call the station at any time at 404-523-8989. And you'll be able to talk to a real person, and they will take your pledge. You also, frankly, can walk into the studio. You can walk into the station with your pledge. We're located at 1083 Austin Avenue Northeast. That's in the little 5 Points area. We're in the community center here at the corner of Austin and Euclid. So we're going to start off with our labor headlines. Postal worker Kenyon Beasley, who is a co-host, is at work. We want to give a shout out to him. We want to say hello as well to Gary Washington, who initiated this program in 1986. That's how long the Labor Forum has been on. So here are just some of the news that you may not have seen on any of the other sources of information you use. Last week, the United Auto Workers, UAW, that's my union, by the way, announced the formation of Local 42 at the Chattanooga Volkswagen plant. Now, you may remember back in mid-February, there was a union election for representation and at the Chattanooga plant, and it generated a right-wing storm of highly inflammatory rhetoric by elected officials such as U.S. Senator Bob Corker and Governor Bill Haslam, who threatened the loss of state funds for expansion of the plant if workers voted union. They essentially said that if the workers voted for a union, the plant was going to shut down and move and they'd all lose their jobs. Millions of dollars for anti-union billboards and TV ads flowed into the area from outside anti-labor groups. And despite going into the election with a majority of the 1,500 workers at the plant signing cards for union representation, after all of this fear-mongering, the vote taken over a several-day period during a snowstorm was 712 voting no to 626 voting yes. The UAW then decided to take this following action. They formed this last week Local 42. After consultation with the Volkswagen management, the agreement is that when a majority of workers join Local 42, it will be recognized by the Volkswagen people. Membership will be voluntary and no union dues will be collected until the Volkswagen recognizes it. Now, Volkswagen is currently in negotiations with the state of Tennessee over the details of a $330 million incentives package to secure the Chattanooga plant as the site to build a new crossover utility vehicle. The UAW announcement intimated that a similar tactic of forming a local without going through an NLRB election could be used for the Nissan plant in Canton, Mississippi, and a Mercedes-Benz plant in Vance, Alabama. We'll certainly be following this development here on the Labor Forum. Also last Monday, we announced on the program that port truck drivers who haul cargo in and out of Los Angeles and Long Beach ports in California had gone out on strike. Now, this past weekend, the drivers returned starting today. It lasted 5 days. The issue is the misclassification of these workers as independent contractors rather than as employees of the trucking firms. Despite working 6 days a week for 10 or more hours, and after paying rental fees for the trucks owned by the company, gas and insurance, these workers make less than minimum wage. Trucking companies changed the terms of employment with deregulation, and over the last 20 or so years, the impoverishment of these professional drivers from having a well-paid career to relying on public aid has been the situation for literally thousands of drivers on both coasts. Savannah port truck drivers are engaged in a similar struggle to become recognized as employees entitled to living wages, the right to join a union, and benefits like workers' comp, Social Security, and unemployment compensation. The Teamsters Union is aiding this organizing drive. The Labor Forum has had Ben Spate, a Georgia organizer, and numerous of the drivers at the Savannah port on this program in the past, and we are working to bring them on again soon. And now for some international news. Britain's largest trade union, Unite, with some 1.3 million members, overwhelmingly approved a resolution at their convention last week to support the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions of Israel. In the language of the resolution, the union is committed to working with others to mount campaigns against complicit companies involved in the occupation of Palestine, the building and maintenance of the apartheid wall, and illegal settlements through workforce pressures, contracts, and pension funds. In a similar fashion, on July 10th, CUSATU, South Africa's union federation, issued a statement on Israel's bombing of Gaza. In part, it reads, CUSATU calls on, will be joining with all who support Palestine and urge the boycott and divestment sanctions movement to organize protests and pickets, calling for the immediate end of Israeli violence against the Palestinian people. They further say it is only those who have lost their humanity who can't feel or share in the pain felt by the suffering people of Palestine from the barbaric and savage attacks by what has become the most acceptable, deliberate, and legalized murder and deliberate violation of international law by a country. They conclude, we call on the international trade union movement, various civil society organizations, international religious bodies to speak out against the savagery and barbarism against fellow human beings. And that the full statement can be found on the COSATU website. And that's our labor headlines for today. And Paul McLennan is here. We had so many good labor history things today. We're actually going to do two. So we're going to have Paul tell us about 1934.
Okay, thank you, Diane. This week, on July 13th in 1934, African American and white farmers formed the Southern Tenant Farmers Union in Arkansas. Since the end of the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, the vast majority of Southern farmers were exploited under semi-feudal labor conditions, paying for their land usage with crops and easily subject to the whims of the white landowners. Their condition was worsened by the Great Depression. With help from radical socialist organizations, they built a successful union, and this is one of the most inspiring chapters of African American and labor history. Originally, the Tenant Farmers Union was formed to protest the eviction of 23 farming families on an Arkansas plantation, but grew in scope to fight generally for the rights of sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and farm laborers. By 1936, the union had spread to Texas, Missouri, Tennessee, Oklahoma, and Missouri, and at its height in 1938 claimed over 30,000 members in over 300 separate locals. In Oklahoma, Otis L. Sweden, a Cherokee farmer, became the union's chief organizer. The state branch argued for land redistribution in eastern Oklahoma, where banks and insurance companies controlled fertile cotton acreage. Throughout its history, this union was remarkable among tenant farmers and sharecropper unions in the South for its commitment in theory and practice to building what was rare for the time in the region, a racially integrated union. In 1935, the union staged a successful cotton pickers' strike that raised the price for picking cotton to 75 cents for 100 pounds. In 1936, the union pressured Arkansas and Oklahoma into appointing commissions to study the conditions of sharecroppers. The studies resulted in passage of legislation protecting some of the rights of tenant farmers. The union faced enormous legal and extralegal violence and repression precisely because of its interracial nature and its attack on the long-standing exploitative agricultural system of the South. Union members and organizers were often harassed by planters who invaded union meetings. They also faced local police who arrested them on various charges, or from terror groups who assaulted them and repeatedly threatened lynching and other forms of violence. Nonetheless, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union briefly thrived. Rallies and meetings, heavily influenced by the Baptist Church, to which most black and white cropper and farming families belonged, were revivalist affairs, complete with union songs, skits, and addresses. Because of the church influence, many women became deeply involved in the union's activities. The Southern Farmer Tenant Union declined by the early 1940s as national attention focused on the coming World War. Radicals were driven out of union leadership positions, and New Deal programs which encouraged the mechanization of farming reduced the need for sharecropping and tenant farming. The legacy of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union as an integrated, vibrant union movement stands as an example of black and white labor militancy and its emphasis on the power of spiritual songs and speeches in social struggle predated the early civil rights movement. In later years, the group's members merged into various unions. First, the United Cannery, Agricultural, Packing, and Allied Workers of America, and later the Amalgamated Meat Cutters Union, which eventually became part of the United Food and Commercial Workers. Also in 1934, this week, on July 16th, the San Francisco General Strike began. With the passage of laws which guaranteed the right of workers to form unions, longshoremen in San Francisco, like workers elsewhere, began pouring into the available unions. During July and August 1933, nearly 95% of the San Francisco longshoremen joined the International Longshoremen's Association. Their greatest grievance was the shape-up, a system of hiring which the longshoremen referred to as the slave market. Every morning at 6 a.m., everyone seeking a day's work longshoring would line up where the foreman would pick out those they wanted for the day. The effect was that longshoremen could never count on steady work and had to work to exhaustion or not be hired again. The union leadership made no attempt to challenge this system, so the more militant workers began forming a rank-and-file movement within the union. This movement forced union officials to accept abolition of the shape-up and its replacement by a union hiring hall, with a strike if this was not accepted within 2 weeks. So on May 9th, a strike began, with longshoremen all along the West Coast, cutting off nearly 2,000 miles of coastland. The lines of the conflict rapidly began to spread. The employers imported large numbers of strikebreakers to unload the ships. Strikebreaking would have seriously threatened the strike, but within 4 days, mass meetings of Teamsters in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Oakland, and Seattle decided overwhelmingly not to haul goods to and from the docks, thus making the strikebreakers' efforts fruitless. Many of the Teamsters joined the picket lines as well. In San Francisco, as much as 70% of the Teamsters' work was on the waterfront. The feeling stirred by seeing the struggle of the longshoremen, combined with their own fear that if the longshoremen were broken, the Teamsters would be attacked next, gave them strong motivation for sympathetic action. Before long, the strike began to idle unrelated industries. Lumber mills shut down in Oregon, for example, because they were unable to ship their products. After 45 days, San Francisco's economy was reeling, and the business community decided the time had come to break the strike. At a meeting on June 23rd, representatives of the Industrial Association, Chamber of Commerce, police commissioners, chief of police, and harbor commissioners agreed to open the port, with the assurance of the chief of police that every available police officer in San Francisco will be detailed to the waterfront to give the necessary protection. On July 3rd, a cordon of freight cars was set up and 700 policemen armed with tear gas and riot guns. A police captain declared the port is open, and 5 trucks manned by strikebreakers rolled from the pier toward the warehouses. Thousands of strikers and sympathizers on the picket line attacked the police lines. After the Independence Day holiday, battle resumed July 5th. In the morning, police charged 2,000 pickets who had gathered to stop trucks coming off the pier and dispersed them after an hour and a half of street and barricade fighting. By the afternoon, a crowd of 5,000 gathered, and when the police could no longer control them with gas, they switched to guns on a large scale. The crowd grew increasingly furious in the face of police shootings, and when the word spread that the National Guard would take over the waterfront that evening, they made a last concerted effort to seize the Beltline Railway on the waterfront before the troops arrived. Unarmed demonstrators were no match for the police, however, and were driven back in a bloody battle. One reporter wrote, "It was as close to actual war as anything but war itself could be. 2 strikers and a bystander were killed. 115 people were hospitalized." That night, the governor of California ordered in 1,700 National Guardsmen who patrolled the area with armored cars and were given orders to shoot to kill. But the conflict had generated a whole new body of allies for the strikers. In the early weeks of June, the feeling had begun to spread among San Francisco workers that a general strike might be necessary to back up the longshoremen. A general strike was felt as a way of expressing their power against all employers. The longshoremen began sending first small committees and then mass delegations of 50 to 400 men to other unions asking for support by a vote for a general strike. On July 9th, a mass funeral procession for the strikers killed in the opening of the port rallied 40,000. It created a tremendous wave of sympathy for the workers, and with it, support for the calling of a general strike. By July 16th, the deadline for the general strike, virtually all San Francisco unions had voted for it. The strike effectively crippled the life of the city. Some 150,000 workers were out, with taxis, trolleys, and street railway workers out in gasoline for private cars embargoed by the strikers. Transportation in the Bay Area virtually stopped. The strike was met with a powerful counterattack. 500 special police were sworn in, and the National Guard contingent was raised to 4,500, complete with infantry, machine gun, tank, and artillery units. State officials were poised on the edge of declaring martial law. Arrested radicals were subject to immigration status inquiries and deportation. The leading California newspapers undertook a coordinated attack on the strike, combining a desire to weaken trade unions with a real fear that the general strike was the beginning of a revolt that might sweep the country. By the fourth day, the strike was over. With the end of the general strike, the longshoremen were forced to accept arbitration of all issues. The longshoremen won some of their main demands, gaining union recognition and a coast-wide agreement, a 12% wage and overtime increase. The workers also acquired a 6-hour day at 30 hours per week with job security and a regular equal share of the work. The strike demonstrated the power of workers when they organize and stand together in solidarity.
Thank you, Paul. I have to say, every week I learn so much more from these vignettes or these stories, this account of the labor history of people here in the United States and around the world. And I want to thank you so much for bringing that to us. We do have our guest on the phone, and I want to thank him for holding on while we finished our This Week in Labor History segment. So I want to welcome to the airwaves of the Labor Forum and WRFG, Abeyomi Azikiwe. He has been on before, and we have found him to be a most informed and can really explain complex things well. Abeyomi, thank you for coming on the Labor Forum.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
So I wanted to talk to you because, well, there's so many things going on in Detroit and Michigan. But the thing that I was specifically interested in, of course, is this crisis with water that literally thousands and thousands and thousands of Detroit residents have had their water shut off, which has even gotten the UN to make a comment on it. So if you wouldn't mind, I'm sorry, I need to introduce you better just because I know you. So Abeyomi is the editor of the Pan-African Newswire. He writes for Workers' World newspaper. He is an activist both in the struggle against foreclosures, the bankruptcy in Detroit, war. He's just the all-around activist and is knowledgeable about all those struggles. So he's able to combine them all together, which is what we really appreciate here at the Labor Forum. So if you wouldn't mind, Abeyomi, if you could start, what the heck is going on that people can get their water turned off, which means you can't take a bath, you can't get a drink of water, you can't flush your toilet, you can't wash your clothes. What else?
Yeah, well, it's a horrendous attack on mainly working and poor people in the city of Detroit. And we believe that it is an effort to drive even more people out of the city, and at the same time to lay the groundwork for the breaking up and privatization of the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, which is a huge undertaking because in this area we're surrounded by a lot of fresh water because we're on the Great Lakes. And at the same time, we have one of the most sophisticated water systems in the United States. So there's really no reason to privatize it. By law, the Detroit Water and Sewage Department cannot run a deficit. They can generate revenue. They do generate a tremendous amount of revenue. But what has happened is that some of the same financial deals that the city of Detroit as a whole fell victim to, the interest rate swaps and other types of bogus bond issues and loans, have also ensnarled the Detroit Water and Sewage Department. So in 2012, the department was forced to pay over $500 million in order to terminate an interest rate swap that was orchestrated and controlled by J.P. Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, UBS. So it's the same.
Abeyomi, I'm sorry. Can I interrupt there?
Yeah.
I know there's got to be somebody out there going, I don't know what an interest swap is.
Well,
like me in the studio.
Well, it's a financial instrument that's sold to municipalities. It was a similar instrument that was utilized in the mortgage industry, where more or less they create paper and they, through loans to municipalities or other entities, they involve themselves in all types of high interest rates. The cities who cannot repay these loans, just think of it in terms of one's house. When people purchased homes or when people refinanced their homes, initially they had payments that were reasonable, but within a short period of time, payments accelerated to the point where they were totally unaffordable, and people went into foreclosure. Either they walked away from their homes or they were evicted. So think of that in terms of a city, municipality, in which you have declining population, declining tax revenue, and these entities are forced to borrow, but they're borrowing on terms that are not favorable to the person that's borrowing.
Gotcha.
So it's the same situation, and they keep, running these same deals. And they haven't stopped. They're still going on, not only in Detroit, but all across the United States. The municipal finance industry, it's the industry in and of itself. The last time I checked, it was valued at $3.7 trillion. This is for the entire United States. And a lot of the people who are invested in this are the same banks I mentioned earlier, Bank of America, UBS, Morgan Stanley, Barclays Bank, you name them. They're all involved in municipal finance because it's big business. So the same thing that has happened to the Detroit General Fund and the other entities, the pension funds, the same process is being carried out against the Detroit Water and Sewage Department. So just think of it in those terms. And most cities around the United States right now are facing the same type of unsustainable obligations, be it in the public pension funds, whether it's in maintaining the infrastructure of the city, the public lighting, the roads, the water systems, utility systems. All of these are under great stress in most urban areas throughout the United States because the powers that be have not reinvested in the city. They have not reinvested in the schools. Most of the money is going to the Pentagon for war and to the banks for interest on mounting debt. So this is at the root cause of all of these problems. Now, they may say that people have arrears in their water bills, and that's why they're being shut off, but that is not the case. We have been going out to the payment centers and leafleting, trying to organize people, and people have told us that their water has been shut off and they owed no money, that their water had been shut off and they owed far less than the $150 that the emergency manager says you have to owe in order to be subjected to a shut-off. So this is more or less acts of terror that are being carried out against the majority African-American population in Detroit.
So, Abeyomi, I've been reading some of the material that I've found on the internet about this, and so one of the things, we have a situation here too for a while in Atlanta where they privatized, turned the water over to a private company, and the rates went up, and there were just so many mismanagement issues, and the city took it back. But let me ask, I've seen that some huge corporations, golf courses, other kinds of profit-making businesses owe tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, and yet there's been no move towards them. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because, and I'm also glad you brought up the fact that Atlanta went through a similar process where they hired a private firm to manage the water system, and it didn't work, and they had to hand it back over to the city. It's also happened in Stockton, California, in Bolivia, South America. There was a big uprising over the efforts to privatize water. But yes, private companies. Now we're talking about Village Holdings, which owns the Detroit Tigers and the Detroit Red Wings, which has a huge entertainment district in downtown Detroit. They owe tens of thousands of dollars in arrears in water bills, and they have not been shut off. The Detroit Golf Course owes over $400,000, and it has not been cut off. And they admitted this on television that yes, and that they were going to focus now on the delinquent commercial accounts, but that remains to be seen. And even at that, it doesn't excuse the massive shutoffs of people who, in most cases, cannot afford to pay their water bills. Rates have gone up by 119% just over the last several years. The Detroit City Council, which is really a toothless, powerless entity under the emergency manager, they work largely at the pleasure of the emergency manager, who is appointed by the governor, who all work at the aegis of the corporations and the banks. They raised water rates again just at the time that this issue was really breaking, as a news story and as a point of focus for activists in Detroit. They raised the water rates by 8.7%. So we're talking about over 125% water rate increase in the last several years to recipients of Detroit Water and Sewage Department services. So you can see what's going on. So people, they were saying, well, most people go out and bill and get the water shut back on within 48 hours. But they won't say what percentage, even if it's 90% or 80%, and I don't believe it's that high. We're still talking about thousands and thousands of people who could not afford to pay those fees plus a deposit to have their water turned back on. So it's really a potential public health disaster that's going on here in the city. And I think it's deliberate, and I think it's a direct result of the role of the corporations and the banks attempting to manage a municipality in the interest of the ruling economic powers in this area. Village Holdings, Quicken Loans, which is owned by Dan Gilbert, who also owns the Cleveland Cavaliers. You have Penske, David Penske, who's a big-time race car magnate. You have Carmanos, who owns CompuWare. These are the real, and the banks like J.P. Morgan and Bank of America. These are the people who really control both the economic and the political reins of the city. So, and they're doing a horrible job in carrying out their policies.
I had a question. This is sounding similar to me to New Orleans after Katrina, as far as a crisis being used as an opportunity to make moves. For example, in New Orleans, when they fired all the public school teachers. Could you say more about this question of driving people out of the city in terms of what the agenda really is?
Yes. Well, we don't have to necessarily speculate, because if we look at even the government data itself, in the last census period between 2000 and 2010, 237,000 residents of the city of Detroit left. And we don't believe they left because they just got tired of the city and wanted to get out of town. They were systematically driven out as a result of predatory lending and mortgages, the theft of jobs, which not only hit Detroit but hit the entire state of Michigan. 1 million jobs were lost during the last census period. and also the whole policy of utility shutoffs, which even DTE Energy, which is a monopoly, virtually a monopoly over electricity and gas services, it's a $20+ billion corporation. They admit that they terminate services for over 100,000 people annually. So all of these actions that are perpetuated by the corporations in terms of the theft of jobs, the banks through predatory lending in both housing as well as municipal finance, and then on top of that, the role of the utility companies, and now the water system, which is operating under an emergency manager. Objectively, yeah, we can say that their policies are forcing more and more people out of the city of Detroit, and that they're attempting to bring in the downtown area and the midtown area people of higher incomes, people who are European Americans, who have no real roots, in the city of Detroit, and try to, expand the population in Detroit by building it through a new demographic. They've done it in other cities like Washington, D.C., which is no longer, from what I understand, a majority African-American city. San Francisco, a similar situation there. So this process, has repeated itself just in the recent period.
Abeyomi, I want to follow up a little bit more on this. So there is no requirement that, for example, if there's young children in a home or somebody who's elderly, infirm, or sick, that their water has to be kept on?
There have been regulations through the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, which is a public entity at this time. But these policies, despite what the media is saying locally as well as around the country, are instituted by the emergency manager, Kevyn Orr. And it was revealed in an article that was published in the Detroit Free Press on June 26th, where his chief spokesperson, Bill Nolan, told the Detroit Free Press that the shutoffs were an integral part of the restructuring of the city of Detroit. And I think that was a very honest statement on his part. So what that means is that they're deliberately shutting off thousands of people's water in an effort to restructure the city in the image of the governor, the emergency manager, and the people in which they work for. Yes, there are regulations, but they're not being enforced. It does not stop anyone from having their water shut off. Just today, one of the activists in the city who has been out at the demonstrations at the Detroit Water and Sewage Department and other actions against the water shutoff. She posted on Facebook that they were going through her neighborhood shutting off water, and they came to her house and attempted to shut off her water. So this is a real situation that's going on. And she has young children, and they don't care. We have senior citizens, we have people who are with disabilities, people who have illnesses, and their water is being shut off because of sometimes less than $150 that is owed. Some people have been cut off by mistake. So it's clearly an act of intimidation.
Abeyomi, can you talk a little about this demonstration and who that company is? Because that's the other thing. The shutoffs are actually not being done, as my understanding, by the Detroit workers, sewage workers.
Yeah.
It's another company. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Well, this is the whole process of privatization. As I talked about the water earlier, in terms of the DPW, Public Works, they have also been privatized. A private company took them over. And now this Homrich company has been contracted by Kevyn Orr, the emergency manager, who was appointed by the governor, to carry out these massive shutoffs. And I believe, according to public accounts, they were given a nearly $6 million contract. That's what's been reported publicly. So yes, last Thursday, a number of activists went over earlier in the morning, before 7 o'clock, and began to picket the entrance and exits of this company and the trucks were not allowed to get out, and some were not allowed to come back in. This went on for over an hour, and then the police were summoned. I'm sure they were summoned much earlier, but they didn't come and actually exercise their presence until over an hour later. And then, of course, people refused to allow the trucks to come by, even after the police had told them to do so. And then, of course, they started to arrest people. They arrested 10 people. They were taken to the Mound Correctional Facility in Detroit, and they were given a $100 bond to get out, and they were issued a summons to come to court on July the 21st, allegedly for disturbing the peace or for disorderly conduct. So it represents somewhat of an escalation because we've been demonstrating for well over a year, and the city and the emergency manager appear to have been trying to avoid arrest, even when civil disobedience was taking place. But this clearly indicates that now they may be willing to become much more repressive, in terms of the police.
Abeyomi, we have to take a quick break for an announcement here at WRFG. We'll be right back, and when we come back, we want to talk a little bit more about this whole issue of bankruptcy, which is facing not just us cities in in Michigan, but across the country. So stay tuned, and we'll be right back with Abeyomi Azikiwe.
Welcome the 25th Pastors for Peace Friendship Caravan to Cuba, led by Reverend Luis Barrios in Atlanta on Monday, July 14th, 6:30 to 9:30 p.m. at Little Five Points Community Center, 1083 Austin at Euclid. For many years, our comrades at IFCO, Pastors for Peace, have shouldered a heavy load in the struggle for peace and justice. This people of color-led interfaith organization is front and center in the Cuban solidarity movement. They have defied the United States embargo against Cuba for over 20-plus years. These trips, now approaching 25 caravans, have delivered tons of supplies to Cuba, gathered along the way as they cross the United States and Canada. They serve as the physical agent for the Cuban medical scholarships awarded to mostly United States students of African descent and Latinos. Pastors for Peace have shown us the true meaning of faith, resistance, and solidarity. A potluck will be held Monday, July 14th at 6:30 in Little Five Points Community Center, 1083 Austin Avenue Northeast, 30307. Participants' food dishes are welcome. For more information, the contact info is Atlanta Peace Caravan at Cinnamon Traveler, that's CINNAMON Traveler.org, or Atlanta for Cuba at yahoo.com. This has been a public service announcement sponsored by your listener-supported station for progressive information, WRFG 89.3 Atlanta.
And you are listening to the Labor Forum here on WRFG. My name is Diane Mathewitz, and my co-host here is Paul McLennan. We are on the phone with Abeyomi Azikiwe from Detroit, who's been really detailing very well this crisis that's facing the working people of Detroit and Michigan. And Paul had a question for you, Abeyomi.
I was curious if you could give our listeners some background about how the emergency manager was put in place, and what were the conditions that led up to that, and what does it say about a violation of the human rights and the democratic process of electing officials to handle public affairs?
That's a very good question because the majority of people, not only in Detroit, but in the state of Michigan, voted in a statewide referendum in November of 2012 against the emergency manager law. It failed in a referendum that was put on the ballot as a result of the collection of well over 220,000 ballot signatures across the state of Michigan. And the law was supposed to be, the existing law was supposed to have been struck down. Then, of course, the state legislature in a lame duck session passed another law to essentially do the same thing, in an even more draconian manner by making it referendum proof through attaching it to a appropriations bill. So Public Act 436, which is in force now, is totally against the will of the not only the people of Detroit, but people in the state of Michigan. So this is what led to the appointment of Kevyn Orr in March of 2013. The law went into effect, and immediately Kevyn Orr was appointed as emergency manager. And in July, which will be 1 year Friday, and there's going to be a big demonstration downtown on Friday against emergency management and against the water shutoffs. Bankruptcy was filed in order to avoid legal challenges to the policy implementations that Kevyn Orr was making. So the bankruptcy itself never should have been recognized or authorized by the federal court, but it was in December of 2013. So what they've done is totally, in essence, denied the right to vote to people who opposed emergency management. And in essence, they nullified the results of an election by doing that. And there's been absolutely no challenge to this from the United States Justice Department Civil Rights Division. And in fact, the government under the current administration has submitted a brief, which we have on our website at moratorium-mi.org, in support of what the emergency manager is doing, as well as the bankruptcy. So there's been no support for the people of the city of Detroit from the federal government at all.
So, Abeyomi, I mean, one of the things that's so incredible is, of course, the situation in Ukraine, where within hours, the U.S. was able to hand over, was it $5 billion?
Yes.
To assist the coup government in Ukraine. And we can go through so many of the other places where there's military interventions. We could talk about the amount of aid the U.S. is supplying to the state of Israel, the planes, the weaponry that's they're using against the people of Palestine. So there's all this money, but has any money come to the city of Detroit from the federal government to assist in any of this, particularly now with water?
No. What happened was that the previous administration of Dave Bing held up and refused to, in conjunction with the governor, turn over grants, federal grants that provided essential services to the city of Detroit and its residents. For example, the Department of Human Services, which actually would take applications to provide grants to people who could not pay their utility bills. Those were systematically defunded through these federal grants, held up approximately $300 or $400 million. And then, this was in 2013, and of course this caused the layoffs of city employees, because there were city employees who were working under these grants. And these grants cost, these jobs were actually funded by the federal government. It wasn't costing the taxpayers in Detroit anything, and at the same time, people were still paying into the public pension system. So what they did was hold up the grants until an emergency manager was appointed. Then the grants were released, but not released to the city, but released to these private so-called philanthropic human services organizations, most of which are based outside the city of Detroit. So they really privatized human services, public health services in the city. They had a public health clinic at Herman Key Hospital, and that was closed, where people could go and have testing and get their blood pressure gauged and all of that. So you can see what's going on, that they're even taking federal money. For example, the Hardest Hit Fund, which is supposed to help keep people in their homes who are having problems paying their mortgages or their taxes, property taxes. Well, they have not released this money to the people who need it, but there's a plan right now being enacted where these funds are going to be used to tear down blighted properties, so-called blighted properties. And they have their own definition as to what is considered blighted. So they're actually going to use funds from the federal government that was supposed to be utilized to keep people in their homes to actually bulldoze more homes and more neighborhoods and this is all being coordinated by Dan Gilbert, who is the owner of Quicken Loans and numerous businesses in this area and throughout the United States. He was essentially given approximately 50 buildings downtown, buildings that were in foreclosure or in receivership. And now he's over deciding which homes are to be raised and which property is to be seized by the Detroit Land Bank Authority. So this is clearly a conflict of interest that you have someone who is this wealthy, who owns this much real estate in downtown, also being in charge of a so-called blight removal task force, which is designed strictly to seize even more land. And of course, we know the land will not be given to the people; it will be, turned over to private investors. So this is what is going on. But there's still tremendous opposition to what's happening in Detroit, and we know that this is unsustainable. Tomorrow, there's going to be a hearing in the federal bankruptcy court of objections. These are rank and file workers, retirees, and employees, and community residents who have filed objections. Over 600 legal objections were filed to this bankruptcy plan of adjustment. And tomorrow they have to have a special hearing where 100 selected objectors will have 5 minutes each to present before the federal bankruptcy judge, Stephen Rhodes. So we're going to pack the court for that. We're going to have a speak out outside after people go and testify in federal court. They can come out and talk to the media, talk to other people who are outside. And then, of course, on Friday, in conjunction with a number of national organizations, the National Nurses United, and others, they're going to be here for the Net Roots conference. It's going to be held at Cobo Hall. Approximately 3,000 guests will be in the city for the conference, and we are appealing to them to come out in the streets on Friday, midday at 1 o'clock for a mass demonstration through the financial district to call for an end to the water shutoffs, to oppose the theft of pensions and public assets, and to also generate other struggles around the country, because this is something that's not just isolated to Detroit. We have Stockton, there's San Bernardino in California, Jefferson County, Alabama is just coming out of bankruptcy, Providence, Rhode Island, in Harrisburg, so many other cities in the United States. The pension systems, they're claiming are grossly underfunded. Illinois is supposed to be on the top of the list. So this is coming to every state and every city around the country.
Do you see a coming together across lines, former lines of division, particularly in the public sector, when we see this kind of assault happening simultaneously in so many places around healthcare, transportation, housing, education, city services? In terms of resistance, do you see a more unified movement coming together to respond to this?
It should happen, and it really has to happen if working people are going to survive in the cities. You go to New York, all the way to San Francisco, people are being driven out of the cities because they can't afford the rents and the mortgages and the utility costs, and now water. So yes, I think all of those sectors of the working class that you mentioned, they have to come together in a national and really an international program against austerity and against privatization, because we see the same thing in Southern Europe. It's happening in South Africa, all over the world. The so-called 1% are attempting to hoard even more wealth, to disempower the working class people, the poor, the unions, the mass organizations, and to really set the economic as well as the political agenda for the coming period. And we have to fight back against that.
Abeyomi, we have about 30 seconds. Is there a website or some other place where people can follow what's happening by those resisting what's going on in Detroit?
Yes, you can log on to the Moratorium Now Coalition website at moratorium-mi.org. That's moratorium-mi.org.
On behalf of Paul and I and Chris and Ozzy and all our listeners, we really thank you so much for this informative discussion that you have offered here about not just what's happening in Detroit, but really what's happening to working people across the country and the globe. So we want to remind our listeners that to tune in again next Monday, and also make sure you make your pledge this week in whatever form you can do it at wrfg.org. This is Diane saying goodbye for now.
We will not bow down.